When Grand Seiko unveiled their popular Four Seasons collection years ago, models such as the SBGJ249 and 415 soared in response to their breathtaking dials and spring drive movements on the inside. But today we'll be looking at a more recent Four Seasons release with the high-beat automatic GMT SBGJ249, a model that takes the burning torch from the previous Four Seasons models and exhibits its own unique flair in the Grand Seiko way. Let's jump in. All right guys, now before we jump into this video, I do want to recommend checking out our newly updated blog looking at some of the best dials in the industry. We have 20 phenomenal choices, variety of different price ranges. So if you like dials like the one here today, check out the link in the description down below. We have a full write-up on that there. So Grand Seiko's origins date back to the year 1960, then an aspirational and more luxurious extension of Seiko's standard collection. However, in the modern context, Grand Seiko and Seiko are more rigidly separate, with Grand Seiko being a strong case study of rebranding in the luxury segment for the 21st century. And while some confusion still likely exists, presenting more of an issue for the mass market than among brands largely in the enthusiast market, models like the aforementioned SBGJ415 and 413, both of which represent the Four Seasons collection, make a very clear statement as to the much higher level that can be expected from Grand Seiko. Again, leaning into the seasonal inspiration, the SBGJ249 was released in 2021. The 249 was developed with an intention to evoke the high summer of Japan, being known as shosho, resembling the reflections of sunlight on rippling waves on a Japanese body of water caused by a gentle wind. And while it is the spring drive which ingeniously combines quartz and automatic caliber technology that is often most associated with modern Grand Seiko, the brand has also a lengthy history with high beat calibers dating back to the year 1968, including the impressively decorated 9S86 housed within this SBGJ249. So diving into our overview portion and starting with a conversation on the case and wearing experience presented by the 249 here, we have a case that does offer some enthusiast-centric metrics and relatively easy wearing dimensions at 39.5 millimeters in diameter and just over 47 millimeters in terms of the overall length. This case format should wear well on all but the smallest or largest of wrists, for me wearing more like a true 40 millimeter case, taking the dial to bezel ratio into consideration. Given the GMT caliber, the additional hand stack needed, and the box section sapphire crystal, the watch is somewhat tall though, at 14.1 millimeters. Though this is a fortunate situation where it doesn't feel that thick on the wrist as a result of the bubbled case back and heavily domed sapphire crystal really taking out the majority of that, or at least a good portion of that thickness. Moving into the case finishing and architecture, the watch as a whole presents a traditional rounded silhouette, complete with the majority high polished finish across the sloping step bezel, the case sides, and across the neatly faceted lugs. The high use of polish on this case compared to others doesn't create the same level of stark angles of differentiation between planes. However, the bracelet follows with the traditional formula with brush and hits of polishing on the exterior points of the center link. The 19 millimeter bracelet tapers to the traditional 2-button deployant style clasp, does feature screwed in links, features a raised GS insignia on top of that clasp, and is secured when locking and does have a lightweight feel, though not as pronounced as its titanium counterparts, and is going to omit the use of micro adjustment, unfortunately, as a result of the slim and tapered clasp that does not protrude out from the underside of the wrist to any noticeable degree. At 3 o'clock, a polished and signed push-pull crown is located without the obvious safety provided by crown guards and pairs with the screw-down affixed and highly domed case back, and securing this watch's uncharacteristic 30 meters of water resistance, and in my opinion, the single biggest drawback presented by this piece. But let's speak to where this watch does excel though, and gets its name with its dial. So Grand Seiko is a brand that have become known for a few defining characteristics: their polished cases, the spring drive movement, and of course, their dials. One of the most commendable aspects of Grand Seiko in their pursuits of exceptional dial making is the tie-ins to Japanese culture and climate. The Four Seasons collection has become a testament to this very idea since its initial launch, with the SBGJ249's rippled wave texture being a beautiful way of exemplifying it. With a primary dial surface channeling a mix of silver and blue, its muted approach helps translate its intriguing texture as an effortless pattern made to mimic the rippling waves of high summer. The individual markings casting horizontally across resemble the harsh brushstrokes of painters, in which the individual strokes can be admired, but it's not until you take a step back when the watery landscape begins to present itself. And as a result, the pattern interacts with changing lighting conditions in an especially eye-catching manner. A half railway style printed minute track sits just within the dial outskirts, interrupted every 5 minutes by faceted indices, each complete with an array of polished surfaces. Just inside, navy blue printed secondary 24-hour markings pair with a heat color matched Aero GMT hand that is co-located with razor sharp faceted Dauphine style hands. At 3, a polished and sculpted date window offers a glimpse of a simple date disc beneath. And at 12, an applied GS signature and brand wordmark sits neatly with the 3-line writing of automatic high beat 36,000 and GMT all stacked at 6. Normally achieving a crisp printing doesn't deserve any extra consideration. However, what is commendable in this instance is how the printing all appears to exist on the same plane in terms of its 3-dimensionality, avoiding the pitfall of being broken up by non-standard texture of the dial finish. Given the more refined positioning of this piece overall, the legibility is still solid, though the secondary GMT markings can be a bit harder to decipher given their smaller printing and use of multiple shades of blue, and there is no lume to speak of. Yet flipping over the watch, we are greeted with an opposing sapphire crystal, providing a view of the high beat movement on the underside. As previously mentioned, high beat calibers have tremendous historical significance to Grand Seiko as a brand, with the first 10 beats per second caliber unveiled back in 1968 within the 61GS. And while much attention has been focused on the spring drive, which we have done a complete extensive breakdown of on the channel, which I can link to down below, it's nice to see Grand Seiko paying time and attention to these higher beat automatic calibers as well. The 9S86 utilized in this GMT variation is of the 9S8 movement model family that was introduced back in 2009, with the entire 98S range of high beat calibers offering a mainspring made of Spron, a proprietary magnetic and shock resistant alloy for Grand Seiko and Seiko, a power reserve of 55 hours, and accuracy regulated to +5 to 3 seconds per day when testing across several positions. In addition to these specs, the 9S86 offers true GMT functionality with an independently adjustable bidirectional local hour time hand that is set at that second crown position without stopping the balance wheel in the process, so no need of actually resetting all the hands to give you that perfect peace of mind when traveling. Although not the same level as the spring drive sweep, the second hand movement is noticeably more smooth, making 10 tiny incremental jumps every second as opposed to 8 or 6 with the industry standard movements running at 3 to 4 hertz. Movement finishing is more about the business than showing artisanal flair. However, it still does look the part, showcasing broad Geneva style waves across the sign skeletonized rotor and central bridges, polished screw heads, a polished barrel, beveling on the bridge edges, and gold-filled engraving. Speaking anecdotally to the accuracy presented by this particular example, this press sample kept time within the established range of -2 to +5 seconds per day when testing across 5 different positions. So now that we've looked at this watch in greater detail, let's talk a bit more about some general takeaways, both in the good and the bad with this piece. Now, let's first say this. This watch is absolutely beautiful when it comes to the dial, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. But I think there's 2 things that I would probably bring up first when talking about maybe some points of criticism. One would have to be the water resistance. 30 meters just doesn't seem appropriate for a watch that's giving this everyday type of functionality of a GMT powered movement. That would have been nice to see some expansion on. It honestly doesn't really make much sense. Also, working in contrast to a point that I'll say is probably the leading attribute that's going for this watch is the legibility. Because of that textured surface and some of the small indications of the GMT functions on that 24-hour scale, it is a tad tougher to read than maybe normally would. But then on the flip side, let's talk about the positives of this piece. I think the number one thing has to be this thing is freaking beautiful. This dial is unlike anything that you're going to really see out there. That's the one thing that's beautiful about Grand Seiko. They are able to take these very stark and directional just strokes in their dials, and as you take kind of a farther step back, you're able to appreciate the full image and pattern that it's creating as a whole. It's just a stunning watch to look at, and despite some of the legibility concerns, I'd be able to overlook it. I think it's just such a nice looking watch. Wearability, I think all things considered, wears like a true 40. I would not be that concerned about the thickness. I don't think it wears as thick as the proposed 14.1. I think it wears less than 14 millimeters in actuality. You get this bubbled like case back on this watch, and it does help with it kind of being pressed down into the wrist compared to some other watches out there. And kind of reminds me of like the oyster case back of some Rolex models and how it's able to wear more flat on the wrist. Bracelet does have screwed in links. It does not have micro adjustments. That's another point I would bring up, but all in all, I think people have just really clung on to the idea of saying, hey, Grand Seiko's bracelet should be better, and then don't give them any credit at all. This to me is a fine bracelet, not class leading, but I don't think it's that far behind. I think people have really gotten caught up in that idea of always just talking down the bracelets. Micro adjustment though, I think that would be nice to see. Case finishing is well done, perhaps not to the same level as some other cases from Grand Seiko. This is more of a rounded profile, and when you're dealing with rounded profiles with, of course, the famous polishing that comes from Grand Seiko, it doesn't actually get to show all the flair that maybe could be exhibited in other instances. But all considered, this is a phenomenal looking watch from Grand Seiko, one of the better looking dials, and that's really the main reason why I wanted to cover it. At the end of the day, that's the number one thing that I've always been drawn to when it comes to Grand Seiko. It's not, sure, the spring drive is fantastic. That's probably also right there. It's just an ingenious way of executing and telling the time. But their finish with their dials is just spectacular, and I think this is a wonderful example of just that. And every single time they release something from the Four Seasons collection, I always am interested. And this was one that stood out as their 2021 models were unveiled. But all right, guys, I'd love to see your comments down below. What are your thoughts on this GMT model from Grand Seiko? In general, what do you also think about the high beat versus the spring drive, and where these GMT models are just positioned in the marketplace? Love to see comments down below. Also, if you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe, and hit the bell icon. Really would appreciate that as well. And be sure to check out our latest blog and article looking at some of the best dials in the industry. If you like dials like this one, we'll have some other ones mapped out in the description in that blog down below. Also, be sure to check out TeddyBaldassarre.com, full authorized dealer of over 30 brands, quick and fast fulfillment, dedicated customer support, and full factory warranty for all the new products that we offer. But guys, thank you again so much for watching. Be well, and I will see you all very soon.